Marcus Thompson had been driving the Route 47 bus for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the city could throw at him. Drunk passengers, road rage incidents, even that time someone brought a live chicken onto his bus. But nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed on that Tuesday afternoon in downtown Seattle. The first sign something was wrong came at 2:47 p.m., according to the digital clock above his windshield. Marcus was pulling up to the stop near Pioneer Square when he noticed the complete absence of the usual crowd. The sidewalks, typically bustling with office workers grabbing late lunches and tourists snapping photos, were eerily empty. "That's weird," Marcus muttered, adjusting his rearview mirror to check on his passengers. Only 3 people remained on the bus: Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who rode his route every Tuesday to visit her doctor, Jake, a college student who always sat in the back with his headphones on, and Patricia Williams, a nurse heading to her shift at Harborview Medical Center. Patricia had been riding his bus for 6 months, and Marcus had grown accustomed to her friendly smile and stories about her patients. As Marcus prepared to close the doors and continue his route, a blood-curdling scream echoed from somewhere down the street. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, raw, terrified, and completely human. Patricia immediately stood up, her medical training kicking in. "Did you hear that?" she asked, moving toward the front of the bus. Marcus nodded, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Through the large front windows, they could see people running in the distance, their movements frantic and desperate. Some were stumbling, falling, getting back up only to continue their panicked flight. But what made Marcus's blood run cold was what they were running from. The figures pursuing them moved with an unnatural gait, their bodies jerky and uncoordinated. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that something was fundamentally wrong with these people. Their clothes were torn and stained with dark substances, and their skin had a sickly, grayish pallor that made them look like walking corpses. "Drive," Patricia said urgently, her voice cutting through Marcus's shock. "We need to get out of here right now." But Marcus couldn't move. He sat frozen, watching in horror as one of the running people, a man in a business suit, was caught by one of the pursuing figures. The attacker lunged forward with inhuman speed, tackling the businessman to the ground. What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. The attacker bit down on the man's neck with savage intensity, and the businessman's screams filled the air until they abruptly stopped. Mrs. Henderson had joined them at the front of the bus, her face pale with fear. "What's happening out there?" she whispered, her arthritic hands gripping the handrail. Jake finally removed his headphones, sensing the tension. "Why aren't we moving?" he asked, but his question was answered when he looked out the window. "Holy shit," he breathed, his usual college bravado evaporating instantly. More of the strange, aggressive figures were emerging from side streets and buildings. They moved in groups, their attention drawn to any source of movement or sound. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as they surrounded a parked car, pounding on the windows with their fists. The driver inside was screaming, but the sound was muffled by the glass. "They're not human," Patricia said quietly, her medical background helping her process what she was seeing. "Look at their movements, their behavior. Something's wrong with them neurologically." Marcus finally snapped out of his trance when he saw a group of these creatures turn toward his bus. Their dead, milky eyes fixed on the large vehicle, and they began moving in his direction with that same unsettling, jerky gait. "Everyone sit down and hold on," Marcus commanded, his years of driving experience taking over. He slammed the bus into gear and pressed the accelerator, the diesel engine roaring to life. The bus lurched forward, and Marcus had to swerve to avoid a cluster of abandoned cars that had been left in the middle of the street. As they drove through the city, the scope of the disaster became clear. Every street they passed showed signs of chaos, overturned vehicles, broken storefront windows, and those horrifying figures wandering aimlessly until they spotted the bus. Then they would give chase, their movements becoming more coordinated and aggressive. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Marcus checked his fuel gauge and made a quick decision. "My depot. It's got high fences and secure buildings. We can figure out what's happening from there." But as they drove deeper into the city, Marcus realized that nowhere might be safe anymore. The radio crackled to life as Marcus navigated through the increasingly chaotic streets. All units, this is Central Dispatch. We have multiple reports of violent incidents throughout the downtown area. Unknown biological hazard suspected. All personnel are advised to maintain safe distance and await further instructions. Patricia grabbed the radio microphone before Marcus could respond. This is Patricia Williams, RN from Harborview Medical. I'm currently on a city bus with 3 other civilians. We're witnessing what appears to be some kind of mass behavioral disorder. The affected individuals are exhibiting extreme aggression and appear to be attacking uninfected persons. The radio went silent for a moment before a different voice responded. Ma'am, this is Fire Chief Reynolds. Can you describe the symptoms you're observing? Patricia looked out the window at another group of the infected shambling past an overturned police car. Pale, grayish skin tone, dilated pupils, loss of fine motor control, and aggressive behavior toward uninfected individuals. They appear to be biting victims, and... She paused, watching as one of the creatures gnawed on what looked like human flesh, consuming human tissue. Mrs. Henderson made a small whimpering sound and covered her eyes. Jake had gone completely pale, his usual college-aged swagger replaced by genuine terror. Marcus continued driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Ma'am, we need you to get to a secure location immediately. The National Guard is being mobilized, but we need civilians to shelter in place until we can establish safe corridors. As if summoned by the radio conversation, a military helicopter suddenly appeared overhead, its rotors beating loudly above the bus. Through the windshield, Marcus could see armed soldiers hanging out the sides, scanning the streets below. The helicopter's loudspeaker crackled to life. Attention citizens. This is the Washington National Guard. A biological emergency has been declared. All civilians must immediately seek shelter in secure buildings and avoid contact with infected individuals. Do not attempt to help anyone showing symptoms of infection. Marcus turned onto Fifth Avenue, hoping to reach his bus depot on the outskirts of downtown. But what he saw made him slam on the brakes. The street ahead was completely blocked by a massive pileup of vehicles. Cars, trucks, and even another city bus had collided in a chaotic tangle of metal and glass. Bodies lay scattered around the wreckage, some motionless, others moving in that horrible, jerky manner that had become all too familiar. We can't get through, Marcus said, his voice tight with stress. I'm going to have to find another route. As he began backing up the bus, Patricia noticed something that made her blood run cold. Marcus, look at the bodies near that accident. Some of them are getting up. She was right. People who had clearly been killed in the crash were slowly rising to their feet, their bodies broken and twisted but somehow still moving. One man's arm was bent at an impossible angle, and a woman's head was partially crushed, yet both were stumbling toward the bus with that same predatory intent. This isn't possible, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Dead people don't just get up and walk around. Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and frailty, showed remarkable composure. I lived through the Cold War, son. I've seen things that weren't supposed to be possible. Right now, we need to focus on staying alive. Marcus found an alternate route, but the detour took them through a residential neighborhood where the situation seemed even worse. Houses stood with their front doors wide open, dark stains on the sidewalks and driveways telling silent stories of violence. Children's toys lay abandoned in yards, and the infected wandered through the streets in larger groups. They're forming packs, Patricia observed, her medical training helping her analyze the situation clinically. Look at how they're moving together, almost like they're coordinating. Indeed, the infected seemed to be gathering in larger groups, their movements becoming more organized. When the bus passed by, entire groups would turn in unison and begin following, their pace increasing as more joined the pursuit. The depot was still 15 minutes away, but Marcus was beginning to doubt they'd make it. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and the infected were appearing in greater numbers on every street. Worse, he could hear emergency sirens in the distance, growing fainter rather than stronger, suggesting that even the city's emergency services were being overwhelmed. We need a plan, Patricia said, checking her phone. I've got no signal. What about you guys? Marcus tried his radio again, but only static responded. Jake's phone showed the same lack of service. They were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a city that was rapidly falling to something that defied all logic and reason. As they approached a major intersection, Marcus saw something that made his heart sink. Military vehicles were positioned at the crossroads, but they sat abandoned, their doors hanging open. Soldiers' equipment lay scattered on the asphalt, and several figures in military fatigues wandered among the vehicles with the same infected gait as the civilians. The army's been overrun, Marcus said quietly. If they can't stop this thing. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the implication. The abandoned military checkpoint painted a grim picture of how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Marcus carefully maneuvered the bus around the scattered vehicles, trying not to look too closely at the figures in military uniforms who were now shambling aimlessly among the wreckage. One soldier, his helmet askew and his uniform torn, looked up at the bus with those same milky, dead eyes they'd seen on all the infected. How long has this been going on? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. I mean, for the military to be overrun this fast. Patricia checked her watch. It's only been about an hour since we first saw them. Whatever this is, it spreads incredibly quickly. She paused, studying the infected soldiers. Look at their wounds. Some of them are fresh, bleeding. But they're not acting like they're in pain. Mrs. Henderson spoke up from her seat. My late husband was in Vietnam. He used to tell me about soldiers who kept fighting even after they'd been shot, running on pure adrenaline. But this is something else entirely. Marcus continued driving, now having to navigate around more and more obstacles. Abandoned cars blocked intersections, and small fires burned unchecked in several buildings. The smell of smoke was beginning to seep into the bus through the ventilation system. Marcus, Patricia said urgently, we need to find somewhere to stop soon. Look at your fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above empty. Marcus had been so focused on driving that he hadn't noticed how low it had gotten. There's a gas station 2 blocks ahead. Maybe we can fuel up and figure out our next move. As they approached the station, they could see it had been the scene of chaos. Cars were lined up at the pumps, their drivers nowhere to be seen. The station's windows were shattered, and the convenience store inside appeared to have been ransacked. But most concerning were the infected wandering through the area, at least a dozen of them moving between the abandoned vehicles. We can't stop here, Jake said, his voice rising in panic. There's too many of them. Marcus was about to agree when the bus engine began to sputter. The fuel gauge needle dropped to empty, and the engine died completely. The bus coasted to a stop about 50 yards from the gas station, leaving them stranded in the middle of the street. Okay, everybody stay calm, Marcus said, though his own voice betrayed his fear. We need to think this through. The infected at the gas station had noticed the bus and were beginning to move in their direction. Their movements were slow but relentless, and Marcus could see more emerging from behind buildings and cars. Patricia stood up and began checking the bus's emergency equipment. There's a first aid kit, some emergency flares, and a crowbar for emergencies. Not much, but it's something. What about the radio? Mrs. Henderson asked. Can we call for help? Marcus tried the radio again, cycling through all the emergency frequencies. Finally, he picked up a weak signal. Anyone out there? National Guard has established a safe zone at the Seattle Center. Repeat, civilian evacuation at the Seattle Center, approach from the north, all other routes compromised. The message was broken and full of static, but it was the first good news they'd heard. The Seattle Center was about 3 miles away, but it might as well have been on the moon given their current situation. We need to move, Patricia said, looking out at the approaching infected. This bus is going to become a trap if we stay here. Jake looked horrified. You want us to go out there? With those things? We don't have a choice, Marcus replied, grabbing the crowbar from the emergency kit. We can't outrun them, but we might be able to avoid them if we're smart about it. Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by standing up with determination. "I'm 82 years old, and I've survived the Great Depression, World War II, and raising 4 children. I'm not about to let some sick people stop me now." Patricia smiled despite the situation. "That's the spirit. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We move as a group, stay quiet, and head for that office building across the street. It looks like it has a secure entrance, and we can reassess from there." Marcus checked the approaching infected. They were still about 30 yards away, moving slowly but steadily. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they reach us. Everyone ready?" Jake was shaking, but he nodded. Mrs. Henderson gripped her purse tightly, her jaw set with determination. Patricia had fashioned a makeshift weapon from a piece of metal she'd found on the bus. "Remember," Marcus said as he prepared to open the door, "no sudden movements, no loud noises. We're going to walk calmly and quietly to that building." He opened the door, and the group stepped out into the chaos of the city street. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of smoke, blood, and something else, something rotten and organic that made them all want to gag. The infected were closer than they'd appeared from inside the bus. Marcus could see their faces clearly now, and what he saw would haunt him forever. These had been normal people just hours ago, a businessman, a teenager, a woman in a nurse's uniform. Now they were something else entirely, their humanity stripped away and replaced by an insatiable hunger. "Stay together," Patricia whispered, and the group began moving toward the office building. Each step felt like an eternity, and Marcus could hear the shuffling footsteps of the infected growing closer behind them. They were halfway across the street when Mrs. Henderson stumbled. Mrs. Henderson's stumble sent a jolt of terror through the group. She had tripped over a piece of debris from an overturned car, and as she fell, her purse scattered its contents across the asphalt with a loud clatter. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings like a dinner bell, and every infected person within hearing distance turned toward them with renewed interest. "Help me up," Mrs. Henderson whispered urgently, but Patricia was already there, pulling the elderly woman to her feet with surprising strength. "Leave the purse," Marcus hissed, but Mrs. Henderson was already reaching for a framed photograph that had fallen from her bag. "It's my husband," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's all I have left of him." Jake, despite his fear, darted forward and scooped up the photograph, handing it to Mrs. Henderson just as the nearest infected person reached them. The creature had once been a middle-aged man in a business suit, but now his tie was askew, his shirt stained with blood, and his eyes held no recognition of their humanity. Marcus swung the crowbar instinctively, catching the infected man in the shoulder. The blow would have dropped a normal person, but the creature barely staggered. It reached out with grasping hands, its fingers curved like claws, and Marcus could see bite marks on its arms where other infected had attacked it. "The head," Patricia shouted, remembering horror movies she'd seen. "You have to hit the head." Marcus adjusted his swing and struck the creature in the temple. This time, it collapsed immediately, its body going limp. But there was no time to celebrate, more infected were converging on their position from all directions. "The building, now!" Patricia commanded, and the group ran the remaining distance to the office building's entrance. The glass doors were locked, but Marcus used the crowbar to smash through the safety glass. The sound of breaking glass seemed to excite the infected even more, and their moaning grew louder and more insistent. Inside the building, they found themselves in a small lobby with elevator doors and a stairwell. The space was dimly lit by emergency lighting, and papers were scattered across the floor as if people had fled in a hurry. "The elevators won't work without power," Jake said, pointing to the dead indicator lights. "Stairs then," Marcus replied, leading them toward the stairwell. "We need to get to a higher floor, somewhere we can barricade ourselves in." As they climbed the stairs, they could hear the infected gathering at the broken entrance below. The moaning was getting louder, and there was a rhythmic banging as they pressed against the doors and walls. "Third floor," Patricia suggested. "High enough to be secure, but not so high that we can't escape if we need to." The third floor appeared to be a small insurance office. Cubicles filled the main space, and there were several private offices around the perimeter. More importantly, the windows offered a view of the street below, allowing them to monitor the situation. What they saw was worse than they'd imagined. The infected weren't just wandering randomly anymore, they were gathering in large groups, and their behavior was becoming more coordinated. Some were standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something, while others moved with purpose towards specific locations. "They're learning," Patricia said quietly, her medical training helping her analyze their behavior. "Or being controlled somehow." Mrs. Henderson had found a chair and was sitting heavily, the photograph of her husband clutched in her hands. "What's happening to our world?" she whispered. Jake was trying his cell phone again, but still no signal. "The towers must be down. Or maybe the government shut down communications." Marcus was barricading the door with office furniture when they heard a new sound: helicopters, multiple aircraft approaching from the north. Through the windows, they could see a formation of military helicopters heading toward the Seattle center. "The evacuation," Patricia said with hope. "They're still running the evacuation." But their relief was short-lived. As they watched, one of the helicopters began to spiral out of control. It was losing altitude rapidly, and they could see people falling from the aircraft. The helicopter crashed into a building about 6 blocks away, sending up a massive fireball that lit up the darkening sky. "Something's wrong," Marcus said grimly. "That wasn't mechanical failure." Through the smoke and flames, they could see figures moving around the crash site. But these weren't rescue workers, they were infected, drawn by the noise and chaos of the crash. "We need to get to the Seattle center," Patricia said, studying the route from their vantage point. "But we can't do it on foot. We need transportation." Jake pointed to the street below. "There's a delivery truck down there. Looks like it's still running, I can see the exhaust." Indeed, a UPS truck was idling at the curb, its driver apparently having fled when the chaos started. The truck was surrounded by infected, but not as many as had been at the gas station. "That's our way out," Marcus said, already formulating a plan. "We create a distraction, get to the truck, and drive to the evacuation point." Mrs. Henderson looked up from her photograph. "What kind of distraction?" Patricia was examining the office supplies around them. "Fire," she said simply. "Set a fire in the building across the street. The infected will go toward the light and heat, and we can slip out the back." It was a desperate plan, but it was their only option. The infected were still gathering below, and they could hear more arriving constantly. The moaning had become a constant background noise, like a chorus of the damned. Marcus gathered flammable materials from the office while Patricia prepared makeshift torches from chair legs and fabric. Jake found a window that faced the building across the street, and Mrs. Henderson kept watch for any changes in the infected's behavior. "Once we start this fire, there's no going back," Marcus warned. "We'll have maybe 10 minutes before this whole area is swarming with them." Everyone nodded grimly. They had no choice but to trust in their plan and each other. The plan required precision timing and more than a little luck. Marcus had fashioned 3 makeshift torches from chair legs, soaked fabric, and cleaning supplies he'd found in a janitor's closet. The building across the street was a small retail complex with what appeared to be a fabric store on the ground floor, perfect for their purposes. "Jake, you've got the best arm," Patricia said, handing him one of the torches. "Think you can get it through that window?" Jake examined the distance and trajectory. "Yeah, I think so. I played baseball in high school." Mrs. Henderson had positioned herself at the window facing the street, monitoring the infected below. "There's about 15 of them around the truck now," she reported. "And more coming from the east." Marcus lit the torches using matches from the office kitchen. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, and the smell of burning fabric filled the air. "Remember, as soon as that fire catches, we move. No hesitation, no looking back." Jake hurled the first torch through the window with impressive accuracy. It sailed across the street and crashed through the fabric store's window in a shower of glass and sparks. Within seconds, they could see flames beginning to spread among the bolts of cloth and synthetic materials. The effect on the infected was immediate and dramatic. their heads turned toward the growing fire as if drawn by an invisible force. They began moving away from the truck and toward the burning building, their movements becoming more agitated and urgent. "Now," Marcus whispered, and they headed for the stairwell. The lobby was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Through the broken glass doors, they could see the infected streaming toward the fire like moths to a flame. The truck sat relatively unguarded, its engine still running, exhaust visible in the cooling evening air. "Stay low, move fast," Patricia instructed as they prepared to exit the building. They crept through the broken doorway and along the wall of the building, using parked cars as cover. The infected were so focused on the fire that they barely noticed the four figures making their way toward the delivery truck. Marcus reached the truck first and carefully opened the driver's door. The keys were still in the ignition, and a half-eaten sandwich on the dashboard suggested the driver had fled in a hurry. "Everyone in, quickly," he whispered. Mrs. Henderson needed help climbing into the high cabin, but Jake and Patricia managed to get her seated while Marcus started the engine. The truck's diesel motor was much louder than the bus had been, and several infected turned at the sound. "Go, go, go!" Patricia shouted as infected began moving toward them. Marcus threw the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, and he had to swerve to avoid a cluster of infected who had turned at the sound of the engine. One of them slammed into the side of the truck with a sickening thud, but Marcus kept driving. The streets toward the Seattle center were a maze of abandoned vehicles and debris. Marcus had to constantly navigate around obstacles, and more than once they had to backtrack when they found roads completely blocked. The infected seemed to be everywhere, drawn by the sound of the truck's engine. "There," Jake pointed ahead. "I can see the Space Needle. We're getting close." But as they approached the Seattle center, it became clear that something was wrong. The area should have been crawling with military personnel and evacuation helicopters, but instead, they saw only more chaos. Several buildings were on fire, and the infected were present in massive numbers. "The evacuation point's been overrun," Patricia said, her voice hollow with despair. Marcus pulled the truck to a stop on a hill overlooking the Seattle center. Below them, they could see the remnants of what had once been a military checkpoint. Barricades had been torn down, military vehicles sat abandoned, and the infected roamed freely through the area. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice cracking with stress. Mrs. Henderson, who had been quiet during the drive, suddenly spoke up. "My nephew has a cabin about an hour north of here. It's isolated, has its own well, and he keeps it stocked with supplies. Can we get there?" Marcus asked, checking the truck's fuel gauge. It showed 3/4 full, enough to make the journey. "Interstate 5, north to Highway 2, Mrs. Henderson replied. "It's rural up there. Maybe this thing hasn't spread that far yet." Patricia was studying the infected movements below. "Look at them," she said. "They're not random anymore. They're moving in patterns, like they're organized." Indeed, the infected appeared to be forming into larger groups, and their movements seemed purposeful rather than aimless. Some groups were heading towards specific buildings, while others appeared to be patrolling certain areas. "We need to move," Marcus said. "Whatever's happening here, it's getting worse." As they prepared to leave the city, they heard a new sound, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The infected suddenly stopped their various activities and turned toward the sound, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. "What is that?" Jake whispered. The sound grew louder, and they could see the infected beginning to move in unison, all heading in the same direction. It was like watching a massive migration, thousands of infected people moving with singular purpose. "We need to go now," Patricia said urgently. "Before they block all the roads." Marcus started the truck and began driving north, away from the city center. Behind them, Seattle burned, and the infected continued their mysterious migration. None of them spoke about what they'd witnessed, but they all understood that this was just the beginning of something much worse. The highway out of the city was surprisingly clear. Most people had apparently fled earlier, or had been caught in the initial chaos. Marcus pushed the truck as fast as he dared, knowing that every minute they delayed increased the chances of encountering more infected. As they left the city limits and entered the forested hills north of Seattle, Mrs. Henderson gave Marcus directions to her nephew's cabin. The road wound through dense woods, and the only light came from the truck's headlights and the glow of fires behind them in the city. "Almost there," Mrs. Henderson said as they turned onto a narrow dirt road. "Just another mile or so." But when they reached the cabin, they found the front door standing wide open, and there was no sign of Mrs. Henderson's nephew anywhere. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall evergreens, its rustic exterior bathed in the truck's headlights. What should have been a welcoming refuge looked ominous with its front door hanging open and no lights visible in any of the windows. Marcus turned off the engine, and they sat in the sudden silence, listening for any signs of life or danger. "David always keeps that door locked," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, staring at her nephew's cabin. "Even when he's home, he keeps it locked." Patricia checked the time on her phone. "It's almost midnight. Maybe he's just sleeping?" But even as she said it, they all knew something was wrong. The cabin had an abandoned feel to it, and there was a strange smell in the air, something organic and unpleasant that was becoming all too familiar. "We need to check it out," Marcus said, grabbing the crowbar from the truck's cab. "But we stay together, and we're ready to run if necessary." They approached the cabin cautiously, Marcus leading with the crowbar raised. The front porch creaked under their weight, and the smell grew stronger as they neared the open door. Inside, the cabin was dark, but Marcus could see scattered papers and overturned furniture. "David?" Mrs. Henderson called softly. "David, are you here?" A low moan answered her from somewhere deeper in the cabin. It was the same sound they'd heard from the infected in the city, a mindless, hungry noise that made their skin crawl. "He's infected," Patricia whispered. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could retreat, a figure appeared in the doorway leading to the cabin's back room. It had once been a man in his 50s, wearing flannel shirt and jeans. Now, his clothes were torn and stained with dark substances, and his eyes held the same milky, dead look they'd seen on all the infected. Mrs. Henderson gasped. "Oh, David, no." The infected man, David, lunged toward them with surprising speed. Marcus swung the crowbar, but in the confined space of the cabin, he couldn't get a clean hit. David crashed into him, and both men went down in a tangle of arms and legs. "Get off him!" Jake shouted, grabbing a poker from the fireplace and swinging it at David's head. The impact made a sickening crack, and David went limp. Mrs. Henderson was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her nephew's body. "He was such a good boy," she whispered. "Always helped me with my garden." Patricia gently took the elderly woman's arm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I'm so sorry. But we need to check the rest of the cabin and secure it for the night." They found evidence of David's final hours scattered throughout the cabin. His laptop was still open, displaying a news website with headlines about the spreading infection. Empty food cans and water bottles suggested he'd been trying to wait out the crisis. A rifle leaned against the wall, but apparently, he'd never had a chance to use it. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to marks on the cabin's back door. "Something broken through here." The door had been forced open from the outside, and there were dark stains on the floor leading from the door to where they'd found David. Whatever had infected him had come from the woods behind the cabin. "We can't stay here," Marcus said, examining the damaged door. "If they found this place once, they'll find it again." But Patricia was already checking the cabin's supplies. "We need food, water, and medical supplies. This might be our only chance to stock up." Mrs. Henderson had stopped crying and was now helping gather supplies with grim determination. "David always kept emergency supplies in the basement," she said. "Enough food and water for several weeks." The basement was accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor. Marcus descended first, flashlight in hand, while the others waited above. What he found was impressive: shelves lined with canned goods, cases of bottled water, medical supplies, and even some camping equipment. "It's like he was preparing for the end of the world," Marcus called up to the others. Maybe he was, Patricia replied, helping to haul supplies up from the basement. They worked quickly, loading the truck with everything they could carry. Jake found a hunting rifle and ammunition, while Patricia gathered medical supplies and water purification tablets. Mrs. Henderson packed food and blankets, moving with efficiency despite her grief. As they worked, they could hear sounds from the surrounding forest, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and occasionally, that low moaning sound that indicated infected were nearby. "We need to move," Marcus said, loading the last of the supplies into the truck. "I can hear them out there." They had just finished loading when the first infected person emerged from the tree line. It was a woman in hiking clothes, her face pale and her movements jerky. She spotted them immediately and let out a loud moan that seemed to call others. "Go!" Patricia shouted, and they all piled into the truck. Marcus started the engine and began driving back down the dirt road, but in the rearview mirror, he could see more infected emerging from the woods. They were moving faster than the ones they'd encountered in the city, and they seemed more coordinated. "They're different out here," Jake observed, looking back at the pursuing infected. "More aggressive." "Maybe the infection is mutating," Patricia suggested. "Or maybe the rural infected haven't had as much contact with large groups, so they're maintaining more of their individual hunting instincts." They reached the main highway and turned north, leaving the infected behind. But the encounter at the cabin had shaken them all. If the infection had spread even to isolated rural areas, where could they possibly be safe? Mrs. Henderson was staring out the window at the dark forest. "I have a friend in Canada," she said quietly. "She lives on a farm about 2 hours from the border. Remote, self-sufficient. Maybe. It's worth a try," Marcus agreed. "At least we have supplies now." As they drove through the night, they passed occasional signs of the spreading chaos, abandoned cars, burning buildings in the distance, and sometimes, groups of infected wandering along the highway. The radio picked up emergency broadcasts, but the messages were becoming more desperate and less coherent. "Advise all civilians to avoid major population centers, reports of infection spreading rapidly, military units have been deployed but, signal lost." The truck's headlights cut through the darkness ahead, and they pressed on toward an uncertain future, carrying with them the hope that somewhere, somehow, there was still a place where the world made sense. The Canadian border crossing at Blaine had been abandoned for hours. The small customs building sat empty, its windows dark and doors hanging open. Cars were scattered across the crossing lanes, some still running with their doors open, suggesting their occupants had fled in panic. Marcus pulled the truck to a stop before the abandoned checkpoint, and they all stared at the eerie scene. "No guards, no officials," Jake observed. "Think we can just drive through?" Patricia was studying the abandoned vehicles. "Look at some of these cars. They're from Vancouver, from Canadian plates. Whatever's happening, it's not contained to the United States." Mrs. Henderson pointed to a sign in both English and French. "My friend lives about 30 miles from here. Small farming community called Clearwater. If anyone can survive this, it's Margaret. She's been living off the grid for 20 years. Marcus navigated the truck around the abandoned vehicles and crossed into Canada. The rural highway stretched ahead of them, dark and empty except for the occasional abandoned car or truck. The infection seemed to have reached even these remote areas, but the density of infected was lower than what they'd encountered in Seattle. "There," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing to a small road sign. "Turn left." Retry this. Response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.